I'm here with Katherine Phillips, Reuben Marc Professor at Columbia Business School. She's a discussant at the 2019 Women at Work Conference at INSEAD's Singapore campus. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You've written about the benefits that diversity brings to organizations in terms of creativity, innovation, and decision-making. Can you elaborate on those a bit?
Yeah. So I've done research that actually shows the causal relationship between having people who are different from each other working together in teams and groups. And what I found in that research is that it's the presence of that social category differences that actually triggers people's expectations that there will be different ideas and perspectives to be pursued in that group discussion. And it basically triggers everybody to work harder and to search for that unique information that they might have amongst them. So you have better outcomes with these diverse teams. Well, at the same time, my research shows that people don't necessarily like it when they're in that diverse environment. So if you ask them, how well did you work together? How effective was your team? How confident are you that you have the right answer? The diverse teams actually say they're less so than the homogeneous teams. And so it kind of helps us to understand the conundrum that we all face when it comes to diversity. We know that it can have better outcomes, but the process of getting there is not necessarily easy. It's hard work.
Another piece that you wrote that I thought was really interesting was in Harvard Business Review, where you talked about women heads of state and their success leading diverse populations, diverse countries.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so I actually collaborated with a woman named Susan Perkins, who's an international scholar, and we had this hunch that what political scientists and economists had found in the past was a relationship between racial ethnic diversity or heterogeneity in a country and GDP growth, so an outcome of kind of economic growth. And they had shown that countries that have more racial diversity have lower GDP growth. And a lot of people thought, well, how is that possible? A lot of it is the conflict and strife, right, that can come when you put people together in these countries. And so we actually thought, well, maybe women, the types of things that we know are characterized in women's leadership styles might be particularly important in those kind of diverse environments, and that's exactly what we found. So we looked at basically all the countries we possibly could have, 190 something, across about 50 years of time, looking at leaders, what their gender was and what the GDP growth was as a function of their time in office. And we found that women were particularly able to mitigate some of those negative effects of racial ethnic diversity at the country level.
Do you think any of this is translatable to a business context?
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I mean, there's some research that actually talks about things like the glass cliff, that women are sometimes sought after to deal with conflict-ridden situations or situations where there's crises. So you can imagine at the country level and the organizational level, those things would be pretty much the same. I think one of the questions that people sometimes ask me is, well, do you mean that those are the only places that women can be successful? And I try to be very clear about that, about the fact that, first of all, no. I think women can be just as successful. We didn't find anything that suggested women weren't just as successful in other countries, right, where they may have led. So it's not that they perform worse than men in homogeneous contexts. There was no evidence of that. I think part of what we need to understand is that women may be bringing a leadership style that may be particularly helpful for some of these really high conflict situations.
I want to explore that leadership style a bit, and since we're at a gender conference, I want to shy away from any kind of stereotyping or gender essentialism. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the differences you found in the women's leadership style and how specifically that might play into unlocking the benefits of diversity.
Yeah, some of what you see are things like trying to create an equal playing field for everybody, right? So actually trying to be more inclusive in making sure that people of different racial ethnic backgrounds, for instance, are represented on their parliament, or that women are represented on the parliament in ways that perhaps past leaders hadn't paid quite enough attention to. There were some examples of people actually recognizing groups that had been not really recognized by the Constitution of their country in the past, and actually saying, these people are real people and they are part of our country and we need to recognize them and make sure that they have opportunities just like everybody else.
These are things that men who are in leadership positions could potentially learn from.
Absolutely. They could absolutely do the same. They could absolutely do the same. I don't think there's anything that suggests that it's essential to women's way of being, or that it's only women can do it.
Combining these two articles that we've talked about, it occurs to me that in many organizations now, particularly large organizations, at the lower tier and the mid-tier, there's a reasonable degree of diversity, but then once you get into the upper tier, not so much.
Yeah.
And from what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like that's kind of like the worst of both worlds, because you have an element of diversity, but then you don't have the leadership skills to unlock the benefits of it.
Yeah, no, that's a really, I think, important insight, right? That ultimately our ability to benefit from the diversity that we have is partially dependent upon leadership and management actually doing the work that it takes for those benefits to arise. And there is research that says that there's a kind of a frozen middle, right? That it is there in the middle of the organization where middle management is really important, that you kind of see people not really buying into diversity as much or not doing the work that's needed to push those diversity efforts ahead. We used to think you've got to get the leaders at the top have to be on board. And most leaders at the top are on board. I mean, there's very few leaders of Fortune 500 companies that you would talk to who would say diversity is not important, right? Or diversity is not something they want to invest in. They all say they want to invest in it, but it's the reality of day-to-day management and work that is required to help those teams work effectively together, where you run into problems, right? And so I think there is, in fact, maybe some interesting things that we'll see happening as the world continues to change and as women continue to rise into those management positions more and more.
Any parting words for us?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that ultimately what I've learned is that we all have to do the work that is required to work effectively with other people. We have to be open to difference and recognize that diversity, you shouldn't necessarily expect that you're going to always get a benefit of diversity, because the reality is it's those contexts where unique information needs to be shared, the problems are complex, you need innovation and change to happen. You have to be open to what diversity brings. And I think diversity basically brings learning. It brings an opportunity for you to realize that your way of seeing the world is not the only way of seeing the world, and that ultimately bringing multiple perspectives together is going to get you a better picture of the truth.
So great. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you.